Hi everybody, welcome back to westernbass.tv. I'm Andy Cooch, Cuccia, and it's August and we're on the California Delta. One of the most intriguing bites that we have out here on the river at this time of the year is fishing up underneath the slop and the overgrown hyacinth and periwinkle and lay down tulies here on the river, and we're going to get out and show you a little bit about this bite today. Hopefully give you a little bit of insight on the wheres and hows to do this. It's a typical bite. You can see we've got a little bit here in the background where we're sitting at the moment now. In the summertime, you get a lot of these fish that'll move up underneath this canopy cover, especially during periods of time when it gets very, very warm. They like the low light conditions up underneath the canopy. It tends to be just a little bit cooler up underneath there. Also, with the plant life growing up in there very well, you've got a little bit more oxygen than what you would normally find in other areas. So these fish like to get up underneath there. When they're up underneath there, it makes it kind of difficult to catch them. Really, the only way that you can get them is to punch right down through that stuff. And we use a couple of baits. Out here on the river, I've used two basic techniques, and the first one is a Texas rig. I've got a 1 ounce bullet weight. I take that weight and I do peg it on the inside with a toothpick to keep it from sliding up and down. I also add a little red bead. Now, one of the things that I do is I like a red bead that's got a little mylar flash on that bead, so that as that thing is bouncing up and down underneath that canopy, the light hits it just right. It's going to give it a little bit of a flash, maybe to attract and trigger the strikes. If we're not getting a lot of light penetration, that little mylar becomes ineffective, but what it does do is you get the little clicking sound of the bass, of that brass bead popping up against that lead weight. So that can also be an added attractant. One of the favorite baits that I like to use up underneath there from a plastic standpoint is a Yamamoto Creature, mostly because it's got a lot of moving parts. I like to stick to green pumpkin. This is the 301 color. It's a green pumpkin. It's got a little green flake and a little bit of purple flakes. One of the things that I'm trying to key on when I'm presenting baits to fish that are up underneath this canopy is I want my baits to simulate the color patterns and shapes of a bluegill. So I like to stick to 4 to 5 inch baits with that green pumpkins and purples. Another bait that works extremely well, you can use the big brush hogs. You can also use Reaction Innovations Sweet Beavers. Watermelon red, again green pumpkin, California 420, those all work extremely well. These tend to punch through some of the thickest vegetation. One of the key things in pegging that weight is you're going to keep that weight right up next to that bait, so that as it falls through, the bait's going to stay with it. If you don't have that weight pegged, what will tend to happen is your weight will tend to fall through and your bait's going to sit up and not follow it down through the hole. So you want to have that heavy weight in there, and you want it pegged so that it falls all the way down through the hole and takes the bait right on along with it down to the bottom. The other baits that I like to use is a 1/2 ounce jig. Now, you can get out here if you got some real thick heavy vegetation and use a 3/4 or 1 ounce lead heads, rubber skirted jigs, but I like to stick to the 1/2 ounce. And mostly what I'm doing with the 1/2 ounce jigs is I'm pitching and flipping it into open holes in areas where I can just gradually shake it and let it fall down through. I like the brown jig the most. It's probably the one I fish with the most often. I'll use 2 color grubs. The Yamamoto 5 inch single tail grub, 164. This is a purple with some blue flake in it. Okay, I like using these grubs because it gives that bait a lot of action once it falls down and hits the bottom and you start swimming it up and down. You've got this tail that really, this big single tail, gets to working a lot. It creates a lot of vibration and water movement down there. It's really kind of calm. The areas that we're going to be fishing today and where you want to be throwing these baits, you're going to be up in areas where you don't have a lot of current. Typically the water is going to be extremely clear, so you'll want to have some, I want to have a plastic bait on there that's creating a lot more flash and a lot more movement with that single tail. You can use a crawdad up underneath there. You can use a crawdad in place of a beaver on the Texas rig as well, but I find that I get a lot more bites when I'm using the single tail grubs. Now, I also use a black jig. There are times when they will eat that black jig just as well. It typically up underneath the majority of these canopies, it's going to be fairly dark. There's not going to be a lot of light penetration, and sometimes, you know, all they see is a dark silhouette, and it's not going to matter whether you're throwing black or brown. But I like to throw that black jig with that purple 213, that's that purple flake, green emerald Yamamoto bait. Again, you can see the jigs that I'm using colors that are imitating bluegills. The reason we do that is because, especially at this time of the year in August, when these fish are up underneath here, the reason they're here, besides the cover and protection and the ambush for forage like they do, is that we have a lot of shad that are moving up that are starting to spawn. You'll see in areas when you're moving in, you'll see the dimples of the shad running up and through the little areas in there. And what that means is you've got bluegills, and in some cases small baby bass, that are up underneath there chasing those shad fry. They're up in there feeding those shad fry. Well, you've got those larger black bass that actually get up underneath there. They're now feeding on the bluegills. They're taking advantage of the unsuspecting bluegills that are up there feeding on the shad. These are the baits that I use. I pretty much stick to them out here. This bite will typically run anywhere from about mid-June right on up through the end of September leading into fall. As long as you've got the big canopy overlays, we've got that extreme warm weather, these fish will get up underneath there. The only thing that tends to slow this bite are two factors. One, when you start beginning to have the very cool temperatures at night, fish tend to not move up into those cooler, shallower areas and stay there all throughout the day. They may not move up in there till later on in the day. The other thing that can cause those fish to move out of this stuff is when they're out here spraying on the river. They're constantly always spraying for the hyacinth out here in from July through August to try and control that. We've had a great growth this year of the periwinkle. I hope to get out there and show you a little bit of difference so that you'll be able to see the difference between the hyacinth and the periwinkle. The periwinkle actually is a little bit easier to fish when it dies as well as when it's in full bloom. I think there tends to be more fish up underneath the periwinkle on a regular basis than up underneath the hyacinth. A couple of the techniques that we're going to be doing today, we're going to actually be pitching and flipping. One of the things that you always want to do when you're working these matted canopy vegetations is first work the outside edges. You can just basically just flip in, work those outside edges. You'll catch those fish that are first moving up in there, that are staging, that really aren't up underneath the canopy. Those can tend to be extremely aggressive fish. You want to try and pick those fish off right away. Then we'll begin to pitch to small openings and flip that jig right in there and just shake it right on down through so that it finds its way to the bottom. And then we just begin to yo-yo. We just yo-yo them. We'll try a lot of different cadences. Sometimes they just want that bait sitting there. Other times we can just lift it up and let it fall back down. Lift it up, let it fall back down. Lift it up. This kind of stuff here where we've got broken up is very easy to punch that jig down through and find the little holes just by flipping in and yo-yoing it up and down. Other times we'll get to areas where it's a little bit thicker, especially as we start to get further back into some of the matted mess. And by just flipping out in there, a lot of times that bait's not going to fall all the way down through. You need to give it a little momentum to get it started. When we do that, what we do is we pitch that jig up in the air 15, 20, 25 feet. We're going to take that jig, and a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just go like I'm in my flipping mode, and I'll get that jig right out in front of me, and I'll just lift it straight up in the air and let it punch right through. And once that jig punches through, then I'm going to go down and just shake it right through there. Shake it right through there. Shake it right through there. Now a lot of times this is a really great technique, especially if you're wanting to try and get further away, but for the most part, I do it just like I'm flipping. I'll stick the rod out, flip that thing straight up in the air, and let it come punch right down through so it falls right down in through there. That way it's getting a lot more force and momentum when it hits that hole, and it falls right down in through there. Now the other way that we can do this is, like I said, just like as if you were pitching, you're going to open the bail, you flip that thing straight up, and let it come right back down and fall down in through that mat. Coming up to a really nice patch here. As you can see, we've got a tule point a little further ahead of us. We've got the little tule point in here, and then we've got this patch of grass that is kind of fulled out. Now this is a really good area where this periwinkle is actually growing out over the low-end grass flat where the grass drops off. Where we're out here is it's about 6-7 foot deep. These are really extremely good types of patches to be looking for. Now this particular one here is extremely thick, and it's going to be very difficult for us to either pitch into. We can try to pitch into some of those holes in there. We can try throwing it up, letting that thing sink through there. Man, this is a really thick one. And what we do when we get to these kind, and this is the importance of using very thick line. I get that jig right to the tip of the rod, and I'll get right up in there, and I'll shove that rod right down in there, believe it or not, and then pull it out and let the line go. Now I've got that jig down inside there, and I'll just sit there and back off. I stay off the trolling motor. It's very important to stay off the trolling motor. You don't want to create too much of a commotion in there, but that is also a very effective way to get that jig down in there and present it. You got to be careful, because especially if you're in situations where, you know, a lot of times these fish are so hot and active, you don't know how many times I've shoved that thing down in there, and before I got a chance to pull my hand away, that fish has already grabbed that jig while my rod is still down inside the muck. You want to be sure to get and remove all of this stuff that's on your rod. But that's another way that you can get in there and present that bait. Get that bait in there, shove it right down in there. This is one where it's about 3 feet, 4 feet, maybe 5 feet deep down in there. But I can get that jig and just shove it right down in there. And then begin to let some line out. And now it's falling through and hitting the bottom. See, and the key here is, like on this one, it's so thick. You know, this stuff is maybe 4 foot thick with the roots, but underneath those roots I've got about 6 more feet. So that bait allows to drop down to where those fish are sitting down there underneath that grass and drop off underneath this canopy. This is a very effective way to be able to get down to those fish. If you've already worked the outer edges and they're not on the outside edges, you can come right in and shove that rod right down in there, and it's not going to bother these fish. If they're down there willing to eat it, you can shove that thing on top of their nose, because I mean, you're really 4 or 5 feet above them. And you can just go right down the bank, shove that rod and that jig right down in there, and pull that line up, and let it sink to the bottom. Let it sink to the bottom. Extremely effective. You don't want to be doing this, guys, with a 6'6", 7 foot medium heavy action rod. You don't want to be doing this with monofilament and 15, 16 pound tests. That light of equipment will not function out here with this kind of stuff. You can use the braid in here when doing this. I personally don't like to use the braid while doing this, because sometimes the bites, when they're not real violent, will come on a slack line, and when I've got slack line, I really can't feel that bite as well as I can with the fluorocarbon. When I've got that fluorocarbon on there, I can feel the bite of those fish, whether I've got slack line or not. Flipping it into the holes, letting it fall through. You can pitch it from long distances. Guide it right into that hole, let it fall through. Let it fall through, let it fall through. Okay? And take that jig and throw it straight up in the air. Let it come down and fall through like that. Or you can take that rod at the end of that jig and you can shove it all the way back down in there. Well, this little patch you can see here, We've got a little combination of green flotsam and cheese starting to grow up, and we've actually got an area that's been sprayed about 3 weeks ago. Most of what you're seeing in here is periwinkle. It's the smaller leaf. It's got a little thicker root system than the hyacinth. The hyacinth is the other plant that's the non-native plant that they're actually spraying for, and because there was hyacinth in with this group of periwinkle, it got killed in combination. But these fish are moving up underneath, and I don't know if we can get this camera in here and get a close-up in this little area here where we have this opening in light dark area. There's a bunch of bait fish that are in there right now, roaming around in there, and when you see those little dimples from those bait fish, that typically is an indication that A, you got forage up there, and B, you've got probably bluegills and some small bass that are in there feeding up underneath this canopy. Now this particular little canopy that we have here probably got about 3 to 4 foot of water underneath it. On the outer edge we've got the green soupy stuff, and you can actually see here where the periwinkle is already starting to recover from the spray, and they're starting to come back. And basically what we're doing in here is we're just going in very quietly and subtly and picking this whole floating mat apart. Now I'll get in there and drop that jig through there. Right now we've got the brown jig and the purple grub in there, and we're looking for those little holes where we pop them in. Sometimes it takes a number of tries and you just got to punch it right through, but the key is you're getting it in there, watching that bait float through. You've got about a foot in this mat here that that bait has got to soak through down below these dead roots before it gets to the bottom. And the key is just getting it to the bottom and then just shaking that jig or lifting and yo-yoing it up and down, yo-yoing it up and down. You know, giving that fish something to look at. They're sitting up in there, they're just kind of cruising. We're still kind of early out here this morning right now. So a lot of times what's been happening in the morning, you'll throw that thing in there and they'll eat it right away. You don't really have to work so hard for them when they're in the area. Another technique we do is when you can't punch it through is we'll throw it up a little bit. Let that half-ounce jig get a head start so that it'll plow right through there. Key little thing about this little particular area and this flotsam is that we've got, you know, you've got some wooded structure up in here. A lot of times you want to look, you'll notice right next to the pieces of wood, you'll see little openings that you can pitch into the wood. I think a lot of times what guys do is they struggle with coming in and trying to put that jig in the teeth or that bait in general into the toughest part, the hardest part to get through. So they end up floating that bait right on top and aren't actually getting it down to the fish. When you can actually look for these holes, if you're just paying attention, you can get that bait right down in there. You're not wasting a lot of time, because a lot of times you can waste a lot of time. When you pull up to a mat such as this, you know, you got to be kind of stealth. You got to be as quiet as possible. You don't want to be blowing right up into it. You don't want to be pushing it around. We've got a little bit of a breeze today, and it's coming at my back, and I've kind of just put us right up on the side of this thing, and I'm not hitting the trolling motor, and I don't want it to push it. I don't want to disturb this mat and any fish that might be sitting up underneath it. So you can see as I pop that jig through, it's not going through. It's not going through. Sometimes you can sit there and shake and pop it and lift it and pull it, lift it and pull it, and eventually it may fall through. But it's a lot easier to just kind of pick that jig up, find the little hole, and put it right in the hole and let it fall through. Let it just let it fall right on through there, and then yo-yo that bait down in there. A lot of times what I'll do when I come up to a mat like this, you know, we'll work this outer edge and then work our way back inside of it. And then when I can't get, if I find I get to an area such as what we got here in this real green thick mat, then I'm going to go to that 1 ounce bait. I'll grab that 1 ounce Texas rig, and we'll get that bait on there. There's that Texas rig I showed you earlier when we were setting up. It's got that 1 ounce weight, that Yamamoto Creature. And I'll get that thing, and now that bait's going to be a lot easier punching through some of that harder stuff. It's going to go through there and get to the bottom a lot easier on some of this thicker stuff. So if I can't just pitch that jig through real easily, then I'll pick up that other bait and throw that heavier bait in there, and I'll do the same thing with that bait. It's got that bead in there, you know, that red bead that I use with that little mylar, you know, up underneath this stuff. There's not a lot of light penetration, so it's not having the light value that I like when I'm fishing in open water and highlight conditions. It gives that little flash bow effect that I think attracts strikes. But what I'm getting out of that bead and that weight is that click, click, click sound as that bait's down there bouncing around. So even though they can't, the light may not be the greatest, I'm down there shaking and popping that thing, trying to utilize that weight and that bead and get that extra clicking sound and maybe try and trigger that strike in that thicker stuff. A lot of times I'll pull up to a little piece of flotsam like this, and we've been on this one here for, you know, about 10, 15, 20 casts and covered quite a few areas, and I didn't get bit. I'm going to get on that trolling motor. We're going to move a little further out. We can see over here, if you look along this flotsam up here, you can see we've got this Thule Island that kind of comes in like a bend, and you've got a point in front of us and a point behind us, and then this is where you've got that current break. We've got that deeper water that comes up in there. You've got the grass flat. Now, what's really good about this one is that you've got this matted area that extends out over the deeper water. This is where you're going to find the most productive fishing most of the day. Now, when you get high tide, you can move back up inside some of this stuff, and we'll show you some other places a little later on that are a little bit better suited for that, where it doesn't come out so far, but you've got very deep pockets up on the inside. Let's just move right over inside here and see if we can find somebody. Yep, there's one right there. He's not a big guy, but there he was. He was sitting right on the edge. Just grabbed that little brown grub. Brown jig and grub right there. Not a big giant Delta bass by any means, but just, you know, there you go, folks. Right there in the edge of that grass, they are there. One of the things that I've noticed, that sometimes these fish won't tend to be near as active further back up in there. They're kind of more concentrated to the outer edges. Later in the day, as it starts to warm up, that sun starts getting really, really high, then those fish will really start becoming more active and pull up underneath this stuff. Today, ironically, we actually have a little bit of cloud cover. And one might think that with that cloud cover, these fish will still get up in there and might tend to be a little bit more active. Another thing to look for in these mats, you can see this little section right here. We've got a situation where, you know, when you look at it, you've got some good clean growth over in the back. You've got some nice high tall growth over on this side. And then right in front, you know, you've got the dead laydown. Now, you visualize this, and with this cover, you've got some structural contours built into this cover, and you've almost got what would resemble as if you were on a lake, a small little creek channel with a series of points, and there's probably a little trough in there. And these are key things to be looking for when you're looking in these mats like this. You want to visualize, you know, what that bass is living under there and why he might be here versus another spot. You know, key. Oh, there was a bite and I just missed him. Yeah, nice little tail grabber. We're going to get another grub on there and get right back in that hole. See if we can get that fish to come back. A lot of times when you get bit down in there, you want to get back in there as fast as you can. Right back in where you went, and then the key is leave that bait in there even longer this time. You're going to sit there and fish that bait because that fish just missed something to eat. And he ain't going nowhere. He's going to sit up in there and he's going to be looking for food, and he's going to be roaming back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Eventually, you know, he's liable. He's hanging in this area for a reason. He's going to come back and he's going to find that grub again. And you can sit there and fish for that fish with that, you know, I threw that brown jig right back in there. Another 2 or 3 minutes down there with that bait. If it's not working, you can pick up the black jig and throw it in there for a couple tries, or you can turn right around and pick that creature up and throw it. A lot of times too, you just move a foot and that fish might be sitting a foot away. You know, he's not far. He's up underneath that mat somewhere, and it's just a matter of picking out where he took off and ran to. I'm just kind of methodically pitching around the edges here where he might be setting up. We've actually even got a little bit of bait in this little section right here. Right in there somewhere. Oh, okay, this area that we've got right here, you notice we've got a little opening here between the tules. You've got some lay down tule clumps in here. This is another really good pattern that you'll find here. It's not just the floating flotsam and the hyacinth and the periwinkle, but you'll find that these lay down tules like this, these fish will get up underneath that as well. These are a little easier to punch through these. You can find the hole because they're typically only one layer or so certain. Once you get, you know, on the surface, they don't have the foot or two down below it. So a lot of times they'll tend to have a little more depth underneath them. Boy, you get one where you get just like fishing down on Brocky Bank, where you get an area where the bank changes from one cover structure to another. A lot of times you'll find here it's the same kind of thing, where we've got the lay down tules and then you've got the periwinkle and the flotsam on the outside. Where the two meet, a lot of times where you're going to find that fish in a situation like this, especially when you got a little creek channel like coming out from between these tules. This is just an ideal ambush point and place where one of these bass would be coming up out of deep water here and following his way up inside there. Yeah, now we just pulled up to this little shallow one here, and I kind of stopped fishing it because it got to be too shallow. And right about that time, oh, he did bit me. Oh, and that fish, he got me too. We were coming through here, Tony and I were just moving down the bank, going up to the next deep one, and I was commenting how shallow this one was, and all of a sudden, bass right up on the bank showed herself. By golly, if I didn't put that jig in there, she'd come and pop it. She really didn't come and she really didn't eat it. Just grabbed that tail is all she did. See, somebody already come running out of here. See, there's yeah, it goes on and on. The majority of what we're seeing in here is that native periwinkle plant. But you can see in little sections like what we have right here, you can see where we've got periwinkle just growing in amongst the two. And this is what they're actually spraying for. They'll get in and spray this where they have the big lettuce leaves. Little purple flowers. You can see the difference in the root system, where you just got really, you can see coming down through there what we're punching through, versus the hyacinth, which has a little different kind of root system. So different times of the year, day, certain conditions, they'll get under one or the other, and a lot of times they'll be under each. But it's this periwinkle where you got to really have those 1 ounce weights to get down through that stuff, because it's really thick. You've got about, you know, 1.5 feet of growth down there. It's wide and a mixture of roots and the stem from the plant, whereas on that hyacinth, you've got the little clump where it all meets, and then you've got a long, skinny root that just goes straight down. So it's actually a little easier to get through that hyacinth sometimes than it is the periwinkle. Boy, there is bait fish everywhere in here. We've got some fish going on up here. That could be carp. Whatever it was, it's pretty big, and she's stuck way back up in there. It almost looked like there was a sea lion back in that stuff. Damn it! Well, certainly that fish was in that slop. Wasn't the fish we were looking for, but he was in there. A little hungry guy. Jeez. Old big fish Cuccia smoking them giants again. That's a nice fish. Right up through that slop. That one, boy, now that one was just sitting right in there. Come right through that hole right there. Threw that jig in there. Before it even hit the bottom, that fish come up and grabbed it. Nice solid 2.5 pound largemouth. Just sitting right up under there. Now we're starting to get the sun starting to get up a little higher. Of course, we've gotten into another one of those little patches. This one here is one of those periwinkles where they sprayed the outside. The fish seem to be on the outer edge right now. I think they're just kind of sort of moving up. We've got the tide starting to get into a high position, so they're just kind of sort of just moving up. We got a little cool morning, but they do seem to be right on the outside edge. We've got a couple little bites. It's been kind of slow this morning because of this cool weather, but we're starting to get now, sun's starting to get up and water's starting to get to a level where these fish are just starting to move to the outside edge of this. You know, as the day moves on, they'll start getting further up underneath it. It's a good bite. Good fish. Those are the kind of fish that we're out here sitting here looking for. You're going to typically catch fish like that pretty much all day long, or better when you're fishing this kind of stuff on the river this time of year. But you saw the key on that, good fast hook set, get that fish's nose up into that slop so that he comes right up through and on top. Typically this isn't, you know, you're not going to get that little finesse tap, tap, tap bite. When one of those fish are up underneath there and they hit that jig or they hit that piece of plastic, they're going to pop it pretty hard. They're not going to be real shy or timid about hitting that bait. It floats down into them, they're going to pop it pretty good, so you got to be ready all the time. Typically, if you're going to get the little tap taps, the little light hits, they're going to be smaller fish like the two I caught a little earlier. But those are those two are kind of funny. I'm not sure why they're sitting up under there. They're liable to be bass, you know, bass forage. They weren't that big that a 10, 12, 13 pounder happened to be up into there. A 3 pounder's not going to eat a bass that big, but certainly those bigger bass will eat their own up underneath there. And you don't typically find too many of them that far up in this stuff. All right, give us another one here. Give us another one here. Now I've rotated between that black and purple jig and that creature bait, and I keep going back to this brown and purple, and that's the one I seem to be getting bit the most on at the moment. Haven't been able to get him to eat either that creature or the black jig. You know, guys have probably heard this from me thousands and thousands of times before. I just think that this river, much like a lot of our lakes, is a brown-purple lake, and I'm fishing that brown, purple, brown and blue, black and blue with that brown and pork in the winter. Just that combination affords me an awful lot of confidence when I'm out here in this river that I can catch fish year-round with that brown jig. Especially when we get into areas like here where we're fishing today, where we've got really gin clear water. Yeah, definitely when you're in the clear water, that brown works a little better. Now you start getting a little south, we start getting into that little dirtier water, well, black jigs become a little bit more effective down there. Crawdad colors change down there, plus it's a little easier to see those black silhouetted baits in that dirtier water that we have on the south part of the river. There's one. Oh, this is a good fish. Nice fish. This fish right there. Look at that bass. Right there. There's a nice mat bass on that black. Right on the edge. That fish was right on the outside edge. Just sitting right there. Grab that black water jig. About 6 foot of water underneath that fish right there. Grab that tail. He ate it pretty good. There you go, folks. Fishing the mats, the California Delta. Put those jigs, put those heavy Texas rigged creatures and brush hogs to work. Punch down through that mat. You're going to find yourself out catching fish like this on the river all summer long when nothing else works. I'm Andy Cooch, Cuccia from the California Delta for westernbass.tv, wishing you a great day and a tight lines.